We are indeed honored to have the gentlemen and ladies here who are going to participate in our conference on Armenian studies. This, we believe, is the first such conference in the history of the Armenian community in America, and we hope this will be the forerunner of many more to come in the future years. At the later part of the evening, I will have a number of announcements to make. At the present time, I would just like to say only a couple of words. As most of you know, the organization was formed for the purpose of advancing Armenian studies and research here in America on a high academic and permanent basis. The purpose of tonight's conference is to focus attention on the many problems and areas of research that have remained untouched, uninvestigated, or very slightly investigated over the years. With the spotlight that each speaker will put on the problems and areas of research, you will have a better idea of what there is to do in the future. You will understand even more than you do now the need for establishing at a university like Harvard University a center of research, of learning and training in Armenian studies, which will guarantee permanence and continuity. As many of you have probably thought about this problem, you have maybe also come to the conclusion that anybody who attempts to do research in this field has to be an exceptionally qualified individual. For in the Armenian area, one must know many languages. One must know the modern and usual languages of English and French and German, Latin and Greek, but he also has to know Armenian, both what we call Sirarpie and Sirarpie. He probably has to know Turkish and Arabic and Persian and Russian, and maybe even Pashto, and many, many more languages. This is one of the formidable barriers that exist insofar as people who desire to do something in this field. Hurdle this type of barrier in his own area of research. Professor Frye is a specialist in Persian studies, and he is a master of all of the languages I have mentioned and many others perhaps that I have left out. It seems that when the day comes that we have our own scholar here at Harvard who will be conducting the studies and the research program, he too will have to be an individual of the same type of background in the command of languages and his understanding of the many disciplines that come to bear on Armenian studies and research. So it is indeed with great pleasure that I take this opportunity to introduce to you the chairman of this evening's program, Professor Richard N. Frye of Harvard University. Professor Frye.
Mr. Young, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great pleasure again to be with you at the second meeting of the association. And without any more ado, repeating what Mr. Young said, I should like very briefly to introduce to you the speakers this evening, so that you may not be wondering who they are in the course of the... I should like to introduce them as they are listed on your program. First, Dr. Paul Bedoukian, over here on the right. Perhaps you could raise your hand, it might help. Thank you. Professor Carleton Coon, Dr. Sirarpie Nersessian, Professor Arthur Jeffery, Dr. Robert Minshaw, Dr. Arsha Sarkisian, Professor Joshua Whatmough, myself. What we shall do this evening is to have 3 talks, and then we will have a break for 15 minutes when we can discuss some of the problems which have been raised and also ask questions. Now, the general theme of tonight's meeting, which, as Mr. Young mentioned, is probably unique in the history of the American Armenian community, if not indeed any place in the world. There have been, of course, times and places where people have gathered together to talk about Armenian studies or to hear papers about them, but never in such an organized meeting, I do believe. So let me call first this evening on Dr. Sirarpie der Nersessian, who is Henri Faucillon Professor of Byzantine Art at the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collection in Washington, D.C., which is a part of Harvard University. You all know Dr. der Nersessian from her publications in regard to Armenian art, her book on Byzantium and Armenia, and this evening she will speak to you about Armenian art and all of its phases. Dr. der Nersessian.
As the program announced, it's a searchlight on the problems in various areas, so that I shall not enter into any specific problems, but outline very briefly to you what are some of the area problems which have been studied, and more what remains to be done. From a very early period, Armenian art took on the characteristics of a national art. In fact, it's an art which throughout the centuries retains some of the outstanding characteristics. That does not mean naturally that it has not been influenced by the art of the neighboring countries. But what I mean by that is that there are certain specific traits which one can recognize as Armenian and which run through the course of the centuries. This applies, of course, primarily to the Armenian Christian art. Very few monuments have survived from the pre-Christian period, that is, from the time which begins with the arrival of the Armenians into what had been the kingdom of Urartu, and the 4th century when Armenia adopted Christianity as a religion. And what has remained, the few survivals of that pagan period, such as the Temple of Garni or some of the rock reliefs, are typically monuments of Roman art or Iranian art, so that they can be called pagan monuments in Armenia rather than Armenian art of the pagan period. But when we come to the Christian period, and especially beginning with the 5th century, the character changes, and then from that time on we can speak of a national Armenian art. In spite of the invasions, wars, and many disasters, there has been quite a large number of monuments which have survived in one form or another in Armenia. And already in the early years of the 19th century, travelers from Western Europe who had been going to Asia Minor, the Caucasus, and Mesopotamia made drawings of these monuments, described them, so that they were the first to make known to the people of Western Europe some of these monuments. English traveler Kirk Porter went there around 1817, 1820. He was followed by a number of others, English, French, and German, so that by the end of the 19th century, already general works on the art of the Christian East took some notice of the monuments of Armenia. But it is really with the 20th century that a more serious consideration and study of Armenian architecture begins. And it was an Armenian architect and scholar, Tora Manyan, who laid the foundations for this study. His collected works have been published in Armenia, and it was primarily through these very careful technical studies that he had made that the great Austrian art historian Strygovsky was able to publish in 1924 his great 2-volume work on Armenian architecture, De Bacchus der Armenier und Europa. If most scholars now, medieval art historians, are agreed that perhaps Strygovsky went too far in his claims considering the Armenian architecture as the fountainhead from which sprang all Christian architecture, both in the East and in the West, even going as far as saying that a church like St. Peter's in Rome is echt Armenisch, typically Armenian. If we think that he has somewhat exaggerated, at least thanks to his work, scholars became much more keenly aware of the Armenian monuments, and I think that everybody recognizes now that Armenian architecture is one of the important schools of architecture of the early Christian and medieval period, that Armenian architecture played a major part in the development of Christian architecture, and that some of its monuments are among the masterpieces of medieval architecture. Since 1924, quite a good deal of work has been done by scholars in Europe, in America, and in Armenia, but a great deal more remains to be done. The special problems have been considered, but for further progress in the study of Armenian architecture, we need more careful investigations of the monuments. We need more accurate ground plans of the monuments. We need more careful studies of the different types of masonries that have been used. We need further excavations, not only to discover monuments which are no longer standing, but even with the monuments which are extant, to find whether the foundations are of the same period, what work has been done, what transformations. And that is the kind of work, naturally, which can only be done in situ, and it's very fortunate that archaeologists and art historians in Armenia are beginning to make more careful investigations. On the whole, though, of the different fields of Armenian art, architecture is the one that has been best known and is best known in general by art historians, and I think that now it's almost impossible to find even a book of general art of the medieval period which does not devote at least a chapter to Armenian architecture. If architecture is a field that is best known, sculpture is perhaps the field that is least known, and where further work should be done, and work of a very extensive character. In the medieval art of these, especially if you consider Byzantine architecture, which was built in brick, there is very little sculpture except in the interior of the churches, on the capitals, in chancel screens or parapets. But the Armenians, who were built in stone, made quite extensive use of architectural sculpture. Of course, the supreme example is the church of Whatmough, of which some of you may have seen fairly recently photographs in the Illustrated London News. The church, which was erected in the early 10th century, is entirely covered with sculpture on the exterior, from the top of the dome to the lower part of the walls on the four sides. But although Whatmough is a unique example in the extensive architectural sculpture, architectural sculpture was used also on other churches, and beginning from a very early period. It's in Armenia that we find for the first time the use of figured sculpture around the doorways, on the portals, and a type of decoration which was to be developed later much more in Western Europe during the Romanesque period. But in Armenia we find such examples already in the 6th century and in the following centuries. And this would have developed certainly much more if figured sculpture had not stopped for a while at the time of the Arab conquest, though it was resumed again in the 13th century during the Georgian occupation and the relative freedom of Armenia. But for our knowledge of architectural sculpture, we are very badly equipped. We have hardly any good photographic material. Some good examples have been produced by Baltruchaitis in one of his books, but for the most part, we have to do with very poor reproductions. The late painter, Fetwajian, who used to live in Boston for a number of years, had made very detailed relevés of these architectural sculpture, and it is to be hoped that these can be published sometime. But even if those were published, they would still not take the place of direct photographs, and for that again we have to rely on the work which is being done in Armenia, or as travel becomes more possible, by work which can be done by other archaeologists who go to Armenia. There is also another area in sculpture which is extremely important, and those are the sculptured steles, the khachkar, which go back to a very early period. In fact, some of the sculptured steles which have survived may go back to the pagan period, and the others, the most interesting ones, date from the 5th to the 7th century, to the time of the Arab invasions. The late Catholicos, Carleton, had published a very important study of these sculptured stele. A few years ago in Armenia, an archaeologist by the name of Archaeology also published a book, unfortunately with very poor illustrations. There again, the material at hand is not sufficient for further investigation. We need also more accurate details. To take just one example, it would be very important to know, for instance, if on the top of these stones there was a groove, a place where a metal cross could have been raised. At present we don't know. That's just a small detail, but a very important one. We'd like to know if originally metal crosses were raised on these. The study of the khachkars is important not only from the point of view of the Armenian sculpture, but also with possible connections with Western Europe. Later in the 9th century and later, these cross stones were frequently used, especially in the British Isles. In Scotland and Ireland, these took on a very special character, and there are very strange similarities between the Armenian cross stones and those which are found in the British Isles, so that one would like to know much better, to be able to study much better the Armenian ones, and then also investigate what possible connections, if any, there might be between these two groups. With the field of painting, if we take one after the other, the large disciplines, architecture, sculpture, and painting, we are on firmer ground. Not, however, with monumental painting. Monumental painting, that is painting in the interiors of the churches, was not very extensive in Armenia, but it did exist. We know it from the few examples which have survived. We know it also from the literary evidence. For instance, in the history of Syunik by Stephanos Orbelian, he gives descriptions of a number of churches erected in the 9th and 10th century, which had very elaborate painted decorations. We know also that in the palaces, for instance, in the palace which was erected at Van, at Bostan rather, near Van, by Kadik al-Kuni, there had been mosaic decorations. But even those few examples which have survived are not properly known. For the church of Akhdamar, they painted in the interior is known only through one or two photographs, very poor photographs of the interior. The same is true for the church of Tikranonens at Anim. There were few paintings which have remained in Cilicia, in the church which was erected in the church of the fortress of Anazarba But so far as I know, our only information about this is just a description that takes about one sentence. So you see that this is very inadequate. But for another field of painting, we are in a much more favorable condition, and that is painting in manuscripts. We have there very ample material for study, almost uninterrupted series of manuscripts which go from the 9th to the end of the 17th century. And many of these are in, not all, but quite a good many, are in museums and libraries outside Armenia. The largest collection is in the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. There are very important collections in Venice, Vienna, in all the libraries of large cities in Europe, and also very choice examples here in America. There have been, in the course of years, monographs of single manuscripts which have been completely reproduced, like the famous Gospel of Echmiadzin of 989, or an earlier manuscript which used to be in the Lazarev Institute in Moscow. There have been albums of photographs and studies. Maclair published quite a number in several volumes. Again, the late Catholicos Bedoukian had made extensive studies in monographs, and it is a great pity that no sponsor was found who could defray the cost of publication of the very important collection of colored copies that he had made. You will see on exhibition in the Widener Library, together with some manuscripts of the Hartford Theological Seminary, the colored edition which was made in Erivan. And although this is a very valuable contribution, it still does not take the place of the collection that had been made by the late Catholicos, and if a sponsor could be found, there is still room and for the second publication. Other manuscripts have been published in various studies. If I may be allowed just a moment to mention some of my own works, publications of manuscripts of Venice, important collection, private collection of Sir Chester Beatty, which has upward of 60 manuscripts, will soon appear, and it will be followed, I hope, shortly by the complete publication of the manuscripts in the Frye Gallery in Washington. And from the year I spent in Jerusalem and in the Near East, I have brought back upward of 3,000 photographs, and with the others which are in which I have upward of 4,000 or close to 5,000 photographs of Armenian manuscripts. I mentioned that simply to make you aware of the great deal of material which is available for study and which can be done abroad, not necessarily in Armenia, though of course it's very important to be able to see also the manuscripts which are at Erivan. What is needed? The field is very vast, the problems numerous and interesting. What is needed are scholars, people who are trained first of all in the history of art of the classical and medieval period in general, and who are further trained in Byzantine art and also in Islamic art, so that they have all the background that is necessary before undertaking the study of Armenian art. It's much better to come to Armenian art having laid the groundwork in knowledge of these other arts, and then to approach the special problems raised by these manuscripts. The Armenian miniaturists reached a very high level of technical excellence. The manuscripts of the 9th and 10th centuries, those of Cilicia of the 13th century, can be counted among the masterpieces of medieval illumination. The problems that they raise are numerous, and they are interesting not only from the point of view of Armenian art, but from the light that they throw also on the art of the Allied countries. I don't want to exceed the time which allotted to the different speakers, so that I shall state very briefly just two other fields in which there also there's room for further investigation. In fact, a field where hardly anything has been done so far. And that is in the field of minor arts. First of all, in the work of jewelry and particularly silversmith work. Our manuscripts, many of them, have silver bindings. The oldest that are known to me go back to the 14th century. But from the 14th century on, there are quite a number of examples, and particularly in the 17th century, there was a very interesting school of silversmith in Caesarea. Some of these have been published by Mr. Kyotian, but one needs to do further work to consider them not only from the point of view of the Armenian art itself, but there again to go back to the sources, both stylistic and iconographic. Another area which would have been a very important one if more examples had survived is that of textiles. Now we know, especially from the writings of the Arab geographers, that the art of weaving, of rug making, was highly developed in Armenia in the Middle Ages, and that the rugs and textiles made in Armenia, especially those which had been dyed with the kirmis, were prized by all the neighboring countries. Unfortunately, so far, no examples have survived or can be recognized as typically Armenian. But I think that there can be one way of finding at least a clue to those. And that would be in collecting, making a systematic search of the materials that have been put in the bindings of the manuscripts. Now, a few years ago, at Yerevan, they published some of the printed text materials that were found in the bindings of manuscripts. But there are also, I'm sure, and I've come across one or two in the course of my investigations, small pieces of woven textiles which in the Middle Ages had been put in the bindings of these manuscripts. And beginning with those, one could perhaps discover in the large collections of textiles in various museums in Europe and in this country, a very important one in Washington, what are some of the textiles that may have been made in Armenia. This is a very general sketch, only to give a kind of bird's eye view of what has been done and also what can still be done in the field of Armenian art. Unfortunately, there are very few specialists working in this field, and yet it's one that is so rewarding, one in which there are so many interesting problems that it is a wonder that more persons have not been attracted by it. But certainly centers such as this, which will focus interest in the various fields of Armenian civilization, may also perhaps attract young students, young scholars into this field. I haven't approached any specific problems because in order to take up specific problems, one would have to demonstrate them, and it is very difficult for an art historian to speak without slides, without showing examples to illustrate what he or she is saying, so that I have had to confine myself to the very general aspects, hoping that this will give you at least a very general idea of the extent of the field, of some of what has been done, and even more of what still remains to be done.
Thank you, Dr. Nersessian. The next speaker has traveled widely in the Near East, all over the North Africa, the Middle East, to be exact, and has engaged in Paleolithic archaeology, and also on the side measuring skulls. I have found traces of him very frequently wherever I've gone. 1952, I remember driving to Baluchistan, and on the road was shown the cave of Professor Coon. Really, it was a big hole in the ground where he'd been digging, but as I say, I found traces of him in Afghanistan and Persia and in Syria and elsewhere. He has written widely archaeological subjects, and also you may know of his book Caravan, a pictorial history of the Middle East. He said that tonight he would speak about archaeology and also tell you some stories. I just warned him not to tell any Russian jokes. Professor Carleton S. Coon of the University of Pennsylvania.
Well, I know I need this thing or not, but thank you very much for having me here. I don't quite know why, but I'm very happy to see you all and address you. And the first speaker told me that we've been arranged in order of mileage. She came from Washington, and she was first, and I come from Philadelphia, so they put me second, which I suppose the last one will be the one who lives the closest to this building. But I'm slightly embarrassed that Dr. Savag has followed me up from Philadelphia. I think he brought this weather with him, because about a week ago when I spoke to his Armenian group in Philadelphia, he took me home through a terrible thunderstorm, and I think it's creeping up on us in his wake. I hope it won't strike until we get through. I really had almost no knowledge of Armenian affairs, and so that if I speak, it will have very little to do with you people or your history or art or anything else. And I hope that you will pardon me for this. And therefore I will make it as brief as I can manage. I was thinking that on the basis of biology, that you all know probably that there's a zoological rule that in all genera and species of animals, you find the strongest, the most vigorous, and those most competent to take care of themselves in the middle of continental areas, and the weakest and most vulnerable and most subject to disappearance through evolution on the fringes of great continental areas. And that's why you find marsupials in Australia, for example. And if you look at a map of the old world and ignore the artificial designations of Europe, Asia, and Africa, probably the nearest point to the middle of the great old world landmass that you could find would be sitting right in Armenia. That, I think, speaks for itself. Well, now, aside from that biological observation, which I don't need to carry any further, I want to say a few things about prehistory. In the first place, we know very little about the Paleolithic archaeology of the area from which our ancestors at one time or another came. But we do know a little from say the Mesolithic and Neolithic on, say around 10,000 to 6,000 BC. And it's a very curious thing that when we dig in caves in Iran and along the Caspian shore, and then when Bob Braidwood goes digging up early villages in the shores of the Tigris and up in the greater and lesser Zab rivers, what do we find? We find little pieces of obsidian. Now these ancient people, they liked obsidian because, it's a black glass, natural volcanic glass, because it makes a marvelous cutting tool. It's easily shaped and easily handled. And there's been a study from the University of Chicago that's been made lately as to where does all of this obsidian come from. It all comes from Lake Van. So at probably around 10,000 to 6,000 BC, or even down to 3,000 BC, somebody was in the business of knocking off flakes of obsidian up around Lake Brown and trading them all over the Middle East. In other words, the habit of producing highly specialized and extremely useful, high-priority consumer goods had begun in that area even at that time. Well, this is very similar to what happened in the Valley of Mexico, where the Aztecs made their living by exploiting a mountain full of obsidian right near Mexico City. They used to knock off these slivers of obsidian and trade them all over Central America, and that is one of the great trade factors which made them become a local empire. Well, now when we go from obsidian onto metal, I think nobody knows exactly where bronze was first made, but it wasn't very far away from there. We have bronze being used in Mesopotamia and other places where there isn't any tin. And it had to come from some place where there is tin, and there is tin up in Anatolia in that area. And it is not unlikely at all that the art of fabricating bronze by smelting copper and tin started right up in that same region. Well then, when we come to around 1100 BC, what do we find? We find the first iron in the world coming right out of the same place. And I've dug up Iron Age stuff in Iran, which is carbon-14 dates of about 1100 BC. And it's associated with pottery, which is exactly the same pottery that you find up in Armenia. And then what do we find after that? We find people who had made this iron starting an imperial form of government, which they passed on to the Persians. And from there on, I think you can trace a little thread of continuity in Middle Eastern history from that Iron Age period down through the times with which Professor Frye and all these other gentlemen sitting here are acquainted, but I am not. I just have to read their works so that I won't mention it. But there has been a continuity, and that part of the world has been extremely important in the initiation of ideas, in the production of highly skilled techniques, and the production of people who are able to handle the techniques. And I think that historical thread of skill, dexterity, and ideas, I'll leave it on the technological side. The rest of you can talk about the other factors, has been probably as important as anything else in the production of civilization in that part of the world and the parts of the world which depend on it. So that is all I can contribute from the archaeological point of view, and most of my digging has been in caves, and I beg Dr. Sayar's pardon if he hears me repeat some of the things I said in Philadelphia the other night. He can leave the room if he's bored. But I've been working since 1939 in caves, and you know, if I went over to Iran or Iraq or Syria or someplace and said, I want to study the people, I want to study the tribes, I want to look at all the different kinds of people, you don't think I'd get a visa, do you? Not very likely. The thing that you study is caves, and if you study caves, there's nobody in the cave that's going to contradict the government or have anything to say about what goes on. And it's a very simple procedure, and also it's extremely interesting, the things that we dig up. Well, I can remember, for example, in 1939, I was digging a cave right outside of Tangier in Morocco, which is a long way from Armenia, but not a long way from the nearest Armenian. I was digging a cave there, and I used to put on a turban to protect my head, because when you're digging caves, you're always smacking up and banging your head, you know, and getting concussions. And I've had too many concussions in my life, and I don't want any more. And so I had on a turban working in there, and there was a sudden little flurry of wind off the Atlantic, and it blew some grit right into my eye. And my left eye, I can remember it. And one of the workmen said, I'll fix it for you. he smoked a pipe of hashish and blew it into my eyeball. 2 or 3 times, and then he grabbed my head and he put his tongue in there and he ran his tongue in underneath my eyelids and completely washed out my eyeball with his tongue. He said, "Now you're okay." Well, I said, I don't think so. I don't feel very good. So I ran out of this cave and ran upstairs, and there was a place where the tourists come. And the tourists come and to see the cave. Well, they didn't see our cave because we kept the path too narrow so they'd fall down. But they went in the other caves. And so there were a bunch of French tourists there. And I remember I ran up and there was a Frenchman and his wife who had a taxi cab. They were about to get in the cab to go back to Tangier, and I asked them in my very best French, "Do you mind letting me share your cab? I've got to go to the doctor. I have something in my eye that's very painful." The Frenchman looked at me, he said, "Sale chien de la rat. Va-t'en!" And, well, I tried another Frenchman. Same thing. Finally, I saw a Jewish prostitute whom I knew, who had picked up a boy, and she said, "Jump in with me, Dr. Coon, I'll take you down." And so I got to the doctor. Well, I knew at that time what was going to happen in Morocco about 15 or 16 years later. Everybody knows. All you have to do is to put on a turban in the presence of Frenchmen, and you could find out what was going to happen in Morocco. And it has happened. So that's the sort of thing that you learn from the mouths of caves. And I'll tell you, I got time, but I'll tell you a few more stories about what happens from the mouths of caves. I was at Bisatoon. Do you know what Bisatoon is? Bisatoon, you know where it is, but anybody else? It's a little village, it's a big village on the road from Kermanshah to Hamadan in Iran. How many of you have been there? This Watertown group hasn't been to Bisatoon, I can see that clearly. Well, I was digging a cave there in 1949, and I had with me a cook, a boy who was the son of the cook of a Presbyterian missionary in Hamadan, and he was a convert to Christianity. And he was earning his way through college at the University of Tehran, and he took on the job of cooking for my expedition for the summer to make enough money to put him through the University of Tehran for that following year. And that boy and the government inspector and the local school teacher, they had a wonderful time together because there was nobody else that they could talk to. They were intellectuals. They discussed all the literature of the world and the great movements and everything. And then they used to come and ask me about things and so on, but not very much. They had a wonderful time. And then one day they decided to go and take a little swim in the river. And they went out there, and of course none of them knew how to swim, but that never occurred to them. And the first one that went out was the cook, and he fell in and drowned. And then I came running up afterwards, and did you hear me all right, or am I too loud? And he said, the inspector came running up, and he said, "Professor," he said, "Nasrat Allah is in the water." And so we ran dashing over there, and Nasrat Allah was in the water all right, but we didn't know whereabouts. And so we looked for him. We finally found him, but it took a long time. We had gypsies playing instruments and drums, and one of the men said, "You see, Professor, the reason why the gypsies are doing this is because there's a big fish down there that's holding Nasrat Allah in his mouth. And this music is going to make the fish open his mouth, and so then the body will come up and he'll find it." But the government man said, "Oh no, Professor, that's not true. This is a scientific age," he said. "There's a big jagged rock down there holding him, and the music's going to shake the rock so his body will come up." Well, the body finally came up, and we went through the formalities, and we dug a grave. We were about to bury him when all the men who were digging the grave walked away and wouldn't do it. They left it for me and my son and a couple of others to do the grave work. I said, "What's the trouble?" They said 2 words, Armenia show. He became an Armenian. This boy had become a Christian, and they finally discovered it at the last moment. And so they all walked out and left the Coon family to do the grave digging. So I began to realize what some of your relatives had gone through during the last 1,000 years or so when I heard those 2 words. Well, I don't want to tell too many stories. That's just a couple of them, but I'll tell one more story about what happened up in a cave in Mazandaran in the northern shore of Iran. We were digging up there in 1951, and the little boy named Syed Hashim, a very poor boy with ragged clothing, he walked all the way from Dumbarton down to Beshar because he heard that there was some digging going on and he wanted a job. Because Eric Schmidt had done some digging at Dumbarton at one time, and he thought, well, the Americans hired my father and my father's dead, maybe they'll hire me. And so Syed Hashim came in and I hired him all right. And there were 3 dervishes. They're working on the sieves. And they belong to an order which is called Haksar, or dirt heads, because they throw dirt on their heads. You know those dirt heads, Dick. And these 3 dirt heads, they were on the sieves, and they were sifting the dirt and picking out the flint and things. They were very wonderful men, and they pooled their money, and all together they bought a watch. So one of them would have the watch, and the other would keep asking him what time it is. Well, they took in Syed Hashim and gave him a home and took care of him while he was working. Well, then another day, another boy came along, and he was very ragged indeed and dirty and hungry. And I asked him what his name was, and he was dressed like an Arab. I said, what's your name? And he said, Ibrahim. And I said, are you an Arab? And he said, yes. So I began talking Arabic to him, not very well, but good enough. And I said, where do you come from, Ibrahim? And he says, Karbala. He said, I have been on a pilgrimage to the holy city of Meshed, and I'm broke, and I'm sort of thumbing my way back home. And can I get a job to earn a little money so that I can get home the rest of the way? And I said, surely, Ibrahim, you can work for me. Well, Ibrahim, the dervishes took him in too, you see. The dervishes thought Ibrahim was a nice boy, and they took him down to their house, that place where they had their chapter house, and so Ibrahim got along very well, but he never could talk Persian. They always asked me to be interpreter. That made me feel very important. I got up and would be interpreter between Ibrahim and the Persians. And that went on very nicely, and he was a very strong boy and a very good worker. It went on for about 3 weeks, in fact. And nobody cracked a smile or anything. I never caught on until one day Ibrahim got very, very sick, and he had his stomach swelled up, and he was lying there in great pain. He could speak Persian perfectly at that point, without the slightest trouble. And so we got our ambulance and took him into the doctor in Beshar. And I asked him, and I said, look, Ibrahim speaks Persian just as well as the rest of you. Why did he make me be interpreter? And they said, Ibrahim comes from Sirarpie, which is a town on the border between Iran and Soviet Russia and Turkmenistan. And there were a tribe of Arabs that came up there in the 8th century and have been there ever since. And they still live in their black tents. They still speak Arabic. And half of them live inside the Soviet Union and half of them live inside of Iran. And Ibrahim lived inside of Iran, and his mother sent him out to get firewood one day, and he wandered over the border and got caught, and they took him up to a big irrigation ditch, and he became a slave laborer. Finally, he escaped, and when he came to my cave, he looked at me and he thought I was a Russian. And so he pretended that he couldn't speak Persian. He carried on this entire great bluff for 3 weeks. And if he hadn't got sick, I probably never would have found out. Well, I mean, that, again, is just an illustration of some of the things that happen when you're working in caves and you find out what goes on. Well, I think my time is up. I mean, I could Give you kids all night.
Thank you, Professor Coon. Now, you all know that the first nation to adopt Christianity as an official religion, as the state religion, was Armenia before Constantine. And the Church of Armenia has been the one great institution which has kept the people together throughout their history. The next speaker has studied the church, Christianity in Armenia, and has studied things Armenian in general. He translated some years ago a letter of Revon, which is published in the Harvard Theological Review, and, as I said, he has continued his interest in things Armenian. Professor Arthur Jeffery, a professor of Arabic, head of the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Studies of Columbia University. Professor Jeffery.
Mr. Young, the President, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. The present speaker is not an Armenian scholar. But as part of his academic duties, he has had occasion to lecture on the Eastern churches, and no one can study the Eastern churches without being acquainted with the life and thought of the Armenian church and knowing something of what it has meant in the history of Eastern Christendom. So perhaps he may be able to sharpen the point of some of the contributions that a Center of Armenian Studies and Research can make to problems of religion. Now, in this area of religion, the contributions which one might expect from a Center of Armenian Studies and Research affect three fields: Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Islam. Some of you may think it rather surprising that a fourth field is not mentioned, namely that of the pre-Christian paganism of Armenia. You are all very familiar with the story of the Christianization of Armenia from the 4th century onwards. But for many centuries before Christianity came, there was a live pagan religion in that area, and surely Armenian Studies and Research should throw light on that religious area. Not much. One of the directions taken by the zeal of those early converts to Christianity was that of obliterating as much as they could of the record of their pagan ancestry, in which they succeeded just about as well as the Arabs did in blotting out all knowledge of the pre-Islamic paganism of Arabia, what they call the days of ignorance. Now, it is true that monuments in Armenia, Armenian mythology and folklore, and the Armenian language itself all have a great deal of light to shed on that old paganism, but that field has been fairly well covered by the investigations of a number of prominent Armenian scholars, and there is not very much left. Unless, of course, there is some extraordinary new access of material, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls have provided for Palestine. There will be light thrown on that early pagan period, but it will come rather from cuneiform studies and Anatolian studies than from the peculiar Armenian studies which interest us in this gathering this evening. In the other three areas, however, the question is very different. First, Christianity. Let us begin with the Bible. The modern biblical scholars are very much interested in the versions, in the Greek version that we call the Septuagint, in the Old Latin version, in the Syriac version, in the Coptic version, in the Ethiopic version. for the light these will throw on various problems of the interpretation of the text. Now, there is an ancient Armenian version. You are all very familiar with the story of Mesrop and Sahak and the little band of translators, of how they gathered manuscripts from Caesarea, from Constantinople, from Edessa, how they even went down to Alexandria to consult ancient manuscripts on points of difficulty, and how they produced a translation which fitted the original like a glove. So the ancient Armenian version has at times been called the queen of the versions. Now, the late Dr. James A. Montgomery in Philadelphia was highly impressed by the value of the ancient Armenian version when he was working on the textual notes for his great commentaries, first on Daniel and then on the books of Kings. And he urged us to have students go into this field and work at the ancient Armenian version. Now, that was very good. But where will they find texts on which to work? Even our libraries don't have them. Those of us who are very fortunate have managed to get a copy of the New Testament in Old Armenian, that edition printed in London 1875, but of the Old Testament. Who of us has been fortunate enough to find a copy of the Zohrab edition of 1805, or even of the later Venice print of 1860? And even if we did find one, it would be an uncritical text, not at all the kind of text that is needed by modern scholarship. Now, of the other versions, we have excellent critical editions. The Cambridge Septuagint, the Vatican work at the present moment on the Old Latin version, the beautiful volumes that Horner has produced on the Coptic version. Of the Ethiopic version, we have the Octateuch by Dilman, and his successors have given us critical editions of the other books. Even of the Georgian version, which is only an offshoot of the Armenian, Professor Robert Blake of Harvard University began to give us critical editions of some of the books. But of the Armenian, nothing. Queen of the versions, is that the way to treat a queen? With our modern techniques of microphotography, it would be a relatively simple matter to secure photographs of all the ancient Armenian manuscripts in the libraries of Europe and the Near East, and with the resources of a great university library, it would not be too difficult a task for a little group of scholars and students in a Center of Armenian Studies and Research to produce a critical edition of that ancient Armenian version, which would be worthy to take its place with the editions we have of the other versions. With that text, it would be possible to tackle the next problem, the history of the version. It's obvious that scholars cannot use a version for critical purposes unless they know the history of its development. Now, of the Syriac version, we know the development very well. The Old Syriac, the work of Rabula and the Peshitta, the revisions giving us the Philoxenian and the Haklian. Of the Coptic version, we know the history, the stages of the Sahidic and the Bohairic and the Achnimic and the Sub-Achnimic, and the relation of these texts to the Hexaplaric text, to the Lucianic text, to the Hesychian text. But the history of the Armenian version, what do we know of it? Well, we know that some of the most ancient Armenian manuscripts still have the hexaplaric marks. We know that in some of the books there is obvious evidence of the influence of the Syriac, probably from those manuscripts from Edessa. But the work that was done by Aberian in 1906 and 1907, and the more recent work in 1950 by Lyonnais, have only shown how much there still is to be done, and that much could be done and elegantly done by students in the Center of Armenian Studies and Research. To move one step away from the canonical scriptures to the uncanonical, the books we call the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha. There is a very lively interest in those writings on the margin of the canon just now because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. For in those caves they found fragments of the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, etc. And they have proved what scholars had long suspected but couldn't prove, that in the 1st century BC up through the 1st century AD, those non-canonical books were greatly loved and widely used in religious circles in the Near East. Now, normally we possess only translations of those non-canonical works: Syriac, Greek, Ethiopic, Latin. But there are Armenian translations. In the old Armenian manuscripts, there is a rich variety of Armenian translations of these works on the margin of the canon. But again, they're not available. When Canon Charles was working on his edition of the Greek text of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, he was well aware of the importance of the Armenian version, and he had knowledge of at least 12 manuscripts. But the only printed text he could use was the old Venice text by Sarkis Josefians, so badly edited that it was only through the critical work of Conybeare and Preußen that he was able to use it at all. Again, when Bruno Violet was working on 4th Ezra, he was able to produce the Latin text, the Greek text, the Ethiopic text, 2 versions of the Arabic text, but for the Armenian, he had nothing but a miserable Latin translation made by Petermann many, many years ago for Hilgenfeld's book Der Messias. Now, in a center of Armenian studies and research, it would be no difficult matter to gather together all the necessary material to produce fine classical editions of the Armenian version of those non-canonical books, at least as good as what the Jews are doing down in Philadelphia for the Jewish Apocrypha. To move one step further away to what we may call the ecclesiastical legends. Now, these are not scripture, they're not even near scripture, but they are writings which were widely used in devotional reading in religious circles in the Near East. And just to take 2 examples which were so popular and so widely known that even Muhammad knew about them and incorporated them into his Quran: the legend of the 7 sleepers and the Alexander legend. There are Armenian versions of both of these. Of the 7 sleepers, Guidi in 1880, when he was preparing his Teste Orientali Inediti, beside his Coptic and Syriac and Ethiopic versions, was able to publish a rather poor specimen of the Armenian version in 2.5 pages, but that's all. And in 1892, Nöldeker, in his study of the Alexander legend, through his friend Hibschmann, was able to make a digest of the Armenian legends of Alexander, but there it stopped. In 1929, when the Spanish Orientalist Garcia Gomez was working on the Alexander legends, all he could do about the Armenian was to refer to Nöldeker. In 1938, here at Harvard University, the late Professor Kersop Lake promised me that one of his students, Dr. Joseph Skinner, would very soon produce the Armenian texts of Alexander. But now it's almost 1958, and there's no Armenian Alexander on my shelves yet. Here is a rich field where competently trained students in a center of Armenian studies and research could fill a great gap and make a distinctive contribution to the study of the documents of religion. And then when we pass on into church history and the history of Christian thought, we're faced with an embarrassment of riches. This audience needs no reminder of the history of Christianity in Armenia, of its missionary activity in Anatolia and in the Caucasus, of its contributions to hymnody and to devotional literature, of the part it had in the dogmatic controversies and the ecclesiastical controversies of the Oriental churches from the 6th century onto the 12th, of its long list of martyrs right down to our present age. You know about it. But outside the Armenian community, how many people who ought to know have any opportunity of knowing about these things? In our theological seminaries today, there is a very distinct upsurge of interest in theology. But you can't blame the younger theologians for being ignorant of the work of the great theologians of the Armenian church, because on our library shelves we have practically nothing. Esnikov called Nersessian or Hali. Was Esnik the only Armenian theologian? Was Nerses the only writer of religious poetry? Are not the theological writings of the Catholicus Sahak, of Gregor of Tati, of Johann of Odznu, of Nerses, of Lambrov, not worthy to stand beside the theologians of the Nestorian and the Jacobite church? Their theologians, like Severus of Antioch, Ephraim Cyrus, their works are wide on our shelf. Why do we not have editions and studies of the works of these great theologians of the Armenian church? J.B. Chabot, in his Synodicon Orientale, has produced a beautiful edition of the synods of the Nestorian church. The Armenian church had its synods, but where is our account of the synods of the Armenian church? Even of the Gachkigtots, there's only one copy we could find in the whole of the United States. And here is work for many students for many years in a center of Armenian studies and research. If we passed into the Byzantine area and the modern area, the work is even greater. But of that I would not dare to speak, where so many of you know so much more in those fields than I can ever do. But may I have just a few moments to speak about the contribution to Zoroastrian studies and to Islam. Many of you are aware that in the historical works of Moses of Chorin, of Agathangelos, of Lazar of Fat, of Toma Atruni, as they deal with the pre-Christian period, they introduce a good deal of Iranian material, and they show quite clearly that there was strong Iranian influence on religion in that pre-Christian period of Armenia. Now that material, much of it, agrees very well with what we have in the Zoroastrian texts. but much of it is strangely different. It could be that the Armenian writers are wrong, that they were mistaken and gave misinformation, but it could be that they are describing a variant type of Iranian religion, differing in many respects from the type which has come down in the classical Zoroastrian documents. Now, with the advances that modern research has made in the study of the Avesta and the Pahlavi writings, and with the understanding we now have of the message of Zoroaster and the development of religion under his followers, it is high time there was a re-examination of all this Armenian material for the light it can shed and for the light that can be shed on it. The Sasanian period brings quite a different problem. No Armenian is ever likely to forget the date 449, for that was the date of the decree of the Sasanian monarch that in his realm there should be no other religion than Zoroastrianism. In his realm there were large numbers of Armenians, and to them that spelled persecution. A persecution which did not cease until the last Sasanian was driven out by the incoming hordes of Islam. Armenians were not the only ones who suffered under those persecutions. Many Greek-speaking, many Syriac-speaking Christians also suffered persecution. And we have Syriac martyrologies. Those Syriac martyrologies have been examined, and it is quite surprising how much material can be gathered from them which throws light on the contemporary religion of the Sasanian period. Now it is evidence from Christian mouths about their persecutors, and so it stands under the possibility of being prejudiced, but nevertheless, over and over again it has thrown most welcome light on what we can gather from our all too scanty Sasanian sources. But there are Armenian martyrologies from the same period. In his book, Monuments of Early Christianity, F.C. Conybeare studied one of these Armenian texts. Most of his examples are of saints who were persecuted by the Greeks or the Romans, but one, which he calls the Acts of Hezibuzit, was of a saint who suffered in the last years of Khosroes I. And the light that comes from those acta on the popular religious life and thought of that Sasanian period is quite extraordinary. Why could we not do the same for the other Armenian martyrologies? There is a wonderful task for competent students in the Center of Armenian Research and Study. And finally, Islam. In 1927, Muldemans, in his study of one little section from the universal history of that 13th century Vatabet Vardan, showed what could be done by careful, sober scholarship interested particularly in historical matters. In 1944, as Dr. Frye reminded you, Professor Nock published a little paper by me on Revon's text of the correspondence between the Muslim Caliph Omar II and the Byzantine Emperor Leo III. And even if that should turn out to be Revon's idea of what they ought to have written to one another rather than what they did write to one another, nevertheless, it brings out very clearly what in Revon's day were thought to be the vital issues between Christianity and Islam. That today is a live subject. On both sides, there is live scrutiny of what these vital issues are between Islam and Christianity. There is no need to remind you of the long and pain-racked history of Armenia under both Arab and Turkish Islam. But that long, pain-filled history produced a great deal of literature, and that literature has a great deal to contribute to our understanding of Muslim life and Muslim thought. The way has been opened by that Orthodox Armenian scholar, Babchin Kulasaryan, and by the Protestant Armenian scholar, Lutfi Livonian, and they ought not to be left without successors. Successors who could be provided by a center of Armenian studies and research. All through its history, Armenia has been noted because of its religion. In our universities and institutions of higher learning, there is today a rising tide of interest in religion, and the Armenian community would not wish to be left making no contribution to that study of religion. Now, universities have no funds except the funds that people give them. But if you will give us these centers of Armenian study and research, if you will give us the tools of research, if you will give us students to be trained for research, Mr. Chairman, we will guarantee the contribution that Armenia will continue to make to the study of religion.
It is not only in the fields of art, archaeology, and in religion and history that Armenian is important, Armenian studies, but of course the language itself. In linguistics, comparative philology. We're fortunate having with us here this evening Professor Joshua Whatmough, Professor of Linguistics at Harvard University, who will speak to you about the Armenian language, the needs, the problems, regard to the study of the Armenian language. Professor Whatmough.
Ladies and gentlemen, when in 1824 George Gordon Noel, Lord Byron, was facing the Turks at Missolonghi, he was at the same time helping to fight the battles of all those who had been oppressed by the Turk. 100 years later, in 1924, John Drinkwater was asked to write a volume to commemorate Byron's death. And the title which he gave to that volume was The Pilgrim of Eternity. Byron, of course, was echoing Shelley. And when Shelley used that phrase, the pilgrim of eternity, he was referring to poets. But professors, too, are pilgrims of eternity. One might borrow a phrase from another poet. this time from Shakespeare, and speak of a professor as well as of a poet, at least if the professor is worth his salt, as a passionate pilgrim. Scholarship is a passion. It is something with which the sun rises and with which the sun sets. It is a great many years now since I first picked up an Armenian English grammar. It's the well-known one, printed originally in Venice in 1819 and subsequently reprinted many times. And in it there are translations into English done by Byron, some of them from the scriptures, and also a few passages of poetry and a fragment of history. But if professors are eternal pilgrims, so also it might be said that of all the institutions with which mankind has surrounded himself on the face of this earth, besides the church, it is the university which comes nearest to what might be called an immortal body. People come and go, but the universities go on, generation after generation, century after century. It might be a matter for regret that Armenian was not offered as a course of instruction at Harvard until as late as 1835, when the late Professor Blake, at my instance, did offer Armenian in what at that time was called comparative philology, but what we have more recently come to call the Department of Linguistics. But it is also a matter of congratulation that this step was taken, and it is also a matter of congratulation that since Blake's lamented death, we have been able to continue offering Armenian, thanks to the interest and enthusiasm of tonight's chairman, Professor Richard Frye. Now, I am not one of those linguists who confine my attention solely to the minutiae of grammar, to such things as structural analysis, etymology, and such like. These are important, but it is also important that the people who handle them should know the language thoroughly and know it well enough to be able to read the literature in the original. The best linguists are always the men who drive a double team, just as the people who study only the literature or the history without having a real command of the original language are equally at a disadvantage. They too should drive a double team. Now, just as historians, by projecting themselves into the past, also at times attempt to see what the lessons of history are, both for the contemporary scene, the time in which we live. Indeed, it doesn't mean much. I don't know that any academic discipline means very much unless it can be applied to the times in which we live. And just as they may sometimes try to foresee the course of events in the future, so languages also have their histories. It's not only a question of learning the language in its present spoken form merely, important as that may be, but also in tracing its history, its relationship with other languages, their borrowings, their mutual relationships. In this way, floods of light can be thrown upon the history of the people who spoke that language, of their adventures, of their comings and goings, of their great and peculiar contributions to their fellow men. In the same way, too, we sometimes try to extrapolate and show the way in which a language is going. Now, this is a comparatively new part of the discipline of linguistics. It's covered up, you might think, by a good deal of mathematics and statistics, but it is also one of the ways of dealing with language. And the striking thing at the moment is the way in which, at least one striking thing, is the way in which the description of a language such as you get in the traditional grammars, or more recently by the stricter methods of structural and descriptive linguistics, and second, the historical and comparative methods, and third, now, the statistical and mathematical method, are all converging upon the same result. Indeed, it is one of the things which encourages us to believe that we are right, especially in this newest of all departures. But in the case of Armenian, there are vast quantities of work that is well worth doing, to be done in every one of these directions. There is enough to keep a whole army of scholars and young students busy for years to come. And I want to say something about a few of the things which are waiting to be done. Professor Minshall, who is going to speak tomorrow afternoon, will pursue this matter further. I know he will. And I'm not going to labor it. It is not an easy matter to explain. It is highly technical in many ways. Now, I don't say this as a preface to trying to talk down to you, but simply to prepare you. I shall put the matter as simply as I can, but simply to prepare you that this is for the realization that this is not by any means easy work. It's going to take some of the best brains that the country produces to tackle this kind of problem. It cannot be news to you to hear Armenian described as an Indo-European language, meaning by that it belongs to a family of languages which are found chiefly in the Old World, in India or in Europe, though not exclusively there, and which, indeed this is no other way of explaining them, must come from a common source. No matter how much they have changed in the course of their histories, they started with a common set of sounds, common set of word forms, a common vocabulary, common ways of combining these words, what we call the syntax of the language, and these are the things which need to be explored. Now, Armenian, of course, is not, certainly was not originally located either in India or in Europe, but in Asia Minor. Nevertheless, it does belong to this group of languages which conventionally we call Indo-European. But for a long time it was not realized that Armenian had an independent position. It was thought to be merely a dialect of Iranian, of the Persian group of languages, and since it is so recently as 1875 that its independent position was made clear, and since also considering that it is not an easy language for people who are not born to it, who do not learn it at their mother's knee, not an easy language to master, the amount of work that has been done specifically in dealing with Armenian problems is much less than it might have been, and on the top of that, discoveries are being made in the Indo-European field, which, as I shall try to show you, do call quite definitely for the light that can be thrown upon their solution from the Armenian side and by people who are sufficiently accomplished to be able to do this work. I say that the position of Armenian is independent, separate group within the Indo-European family of languages, and it would be an easy matter to develop that particular point, show on what grounds we reach this conclusion, and how it is distinct quite definitely from the Persian group with which it was for so long regarded as merely a dialect. Well, let me dwell on it very, very briefly indeed. Iranian, like the Sanskrit, like the Indic languages, fail to distinguish clearly between the Indo-European R and the Indo-European L. Armenian does so distinguish. That is one of the little pieces of evidence, which there are many, that show that Armenian does occupy an independent position. Or again, in contrast with the Indic languages at any rate, though not with the Persian, this I suppose was one of the stumbling blocks. Armenian goes, for example, with Greek or with Welsh in regard to some other details. Doesn't need me to tell you that the Armenian for old is Heen. Well, I used to take my walks round by the old mill in North Wales in my student days, or rather in my first lecturing job, and the old mill in Welsh is Feilin Hain. Hain is old. Greek also has this particular thing. The last day of the month is Hene Kainea, literally the old and the new moon. Now I should bore you if I went on very much longer with this kind of thing, but these are a few illustrations of the kind of evidence that has been used to establish the independent position of Armenian. Now there is one thing in connection with the history of Armenian that I have wanted to see explored for the 30 years that I have been teaching at Harvard. But again, it is a thing which is still left undone precisely because there aren't people trained to do it. We know, partly on the basis of historical records and shifts of peoples quite in the dawn of history, that there is a great belt which also has linguistic links running from Armenian, including the old classical Armenian of the early centuries of this era, tying back to the ancient Phrygian, of which there are inscriptions preserved in Asia Minor, one of which, by the way, mentions King Midas of the Golden Touch by name, and tying up Phrygian, of course, with the ancient Trojans who were Phrygians, and from them across the Hellespont into Thrace, where there is an ancient tribe that has the same name, Briges, the Phrygians. From them to the substratum of language which underlies modern Romanian, and from that across into Albanian and the older language upon which the modern Albanian rests. Now, to be able to solve the kind of problem which is tied up in this particular complex, it would be necessary, you see, for a person not only to be a good Indo-Europeanist, but also to have specialized, among other things, in Armenian. He simply couldn't tackle the problem. And yet it's a very interesting one in itself. Let me illustrate very briefly. The Romanian word for a swan is barșla. All swans being supposed to be white before the day of the discovery of Australia. And this word means quite simply white. It is the Albanian word barvi, which also means white, and the Sanskrit brajate, which means to gleam or to shine, to be white. Or again, take one of the names by which the Trojans, the people of Troy, are known in Homer. He not only calls them Troyes, he also calls them Phryges or Phrygians, but in addition he calls them Dardanioi, very common name of the Trojans in Homer. Well, this turns up also, you see, in Albanian. Darve in Albanian means wild pear. Darvan was originally a pear grower or horticulturalist. From that came to mean a peasant. And this name of the ancient Trojans, the Dardanioi, undoubtedly meant to begin with cultivators. It's the classical Greek hakerdos, which means a wild pear also. And not only in items of vocabulary in this way, but also in some of the sound shifts on which comparative linguists lay so very much stress. There are absolutely parallel shifts of consonant groups in Albanian, Thracian, Romanian, and in Armenian. And I strongly suspect that there is a great deal more which needs to be worked out in detail and in regard to similar problems. Well, now I come to what I said would be a technical and somewhat difficult matter. I trust that what I've been saying so far is not too difficult, because this is a little harder. But if it does seem so to you, then let me remind you that here is something to put you on your mettle, something where a worthy student can take the bit between his teeth and pitch in and do a real job. It has long been observed that in the case of Armenian, where the other Indo-European languages show an initial W sound, for example, the English word work, the Greek for which is ergon, originally wergon, it has lost that initial W sound. But the Armenian is kohe, with a G sound beginning. And yet, in spite of this, there are also examples in the Indo-European languages in which once more you have this initial W sound, for instance, Sanskrit, vasmi, meaning I am willing, and in Greek, hekon, older, hwekon, also meaning willing, where yet Armenian has the, vasen, meaning willing. You must forgive my pronunciation if it appears outlandish to you. It's probably a bookish pronunciation. Now this has exercised people for a long time. Over 50 years ago, a Cambridge scholar, H.D. Derbyshire, tried to settle it in a way which nobody paid any attention to at that time, on the assumption that there were two different kinds of W sound originally, one of which gave rise to the G in Armenian, and the other gave rise to the V sound. Now it's only within the last few years, at least the last quarter of a century, that we've begun to get any kind of light on this particular problem. The curious thing is that Derbyshire was right in suggesting that the proper restoration was consonantal U or W, where, shall we say, Sanskrit has W and Armenian also has W, but that the correct source was a different kind of W, which he wrote WH, when English or German has W, but Armenian has G. We now know, with the help of Hittite, also spoken in Asia Minor in ancient times, that there was originally a sound which was responsible for this particular distinction. We know this with the help, for example, of the Hittite word hurdai, he curses, side by side with our English word word, that there was at one time this trace of this particular laryngeal sound, this sound produced way back in the throat. Now, I must not elaborate on this kind of thing. Let me mention very briefly the importance, well, for instance, of the inscriptions found around Lake Van, the Vannic dialect, Vannic inscriptions, which tie up, quite certainly, with an extremely ancient stratum of language that runs all through the Mediterranean, from Asia Minor across the Aegean into prehistoric Greece and Italy, and even across to the Iberian Peninsula. After all that Professor Jeffery has said about the importance of the literary text, and here for a moment I am going to desert language, well, not quite, but to show the way in which the text has a very considerable linguistic importance. Nothing, I think, would be more satisfactory for students of the New Testament than to have the Armenian texts edited into better shape. Some years ago, among other things, I did teach the course in Gothic here. And since I'm also a classical scholar, I always read the Gothic text with the Greek text on the opposite page, not as a translation or a top, but simply to be able to compare the Greek original with the Gothic version. And I was very much struck by the verse, you're all familiar with it, Mark 7:3, in which it says, the Jews, when they come home from market, do not eat until they have washed their hands and their faces and their pots and pans and their bedsteads. Now, why in thunder should they wash their bedsteads? after they've been to market and before they eat a square meal. This is an incomprehensible sort of thing. You'll find it also in the King James Version. The fact of the matter is that the Greek original was misunderstood. The Greek original has xestone, genitive plural, which is commonly interpreted as genitive plural xestes, meaning a piece of wood sawn off. As a matter of fact, it is the genitive plural of a Latin word borrowed into Greek, sextarius, xestos, meaning a pint pot. And so it was not their bedsteads, but once more their pots and pans that they washed. Now there are many problems similar to that in the interpretation of the Greek New Testament. And on some of these, well, if I were a betting man, I would bet my best hat. On some of these, I'm quite sure the Armenian versions, the Armenian texts, would throw a good deal of light. Now, of course, we have a modest beginning here. Not only the beginning of a foundation to which many of you have generously contributed, but also beginning collections of books which you can see on exhibit in the Widener Library, particularly those accumulated by Mr. Hofer and Mr. Bentic Smith, and which they are giving to the library. I have told you about some of the things which still have to be done, and I take it that professors, no matter how much they may be eternal pilgrims or passionate pilgrims either, are not much supposed to meddle in finance. But still it is true, these things cannot be done without the proper kind of support. Some of you, some of your friends at any rate, some of your countrymen have been successful in this country. And I would ask you to commend to them, in contrast with some of the other things that I've been trying to say, commend to them that most opprobrious of all epitaphs, Luke 16:22, and the rich man also died and was buried. Now, that is the difference. People come and go. They live and they die. But the universities, scholarship, and the spirit of learning, these are the eternal things, the eternal pilgrims.
Thank you very much, Professor Whatmough. Now, the time is getting late, and I think we will only have time for one more speaker this evening. And the other two we will have tomorrow afternoon. So I should like to call now on Dr. Paul Bedoukian, who will speak to you about coins, Armenian coinage. Dr. Bedoukian from New York City.
Thank you, Professor Frye. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy for this opportunity of speaking to you about numismatics of Armenia. Numismatics, as you know, is the study of coins. I collect coins, I like coins, and I like to talk about them. But I will try and curb my enthusiasm so that this talk of mine about coins won't last too long. Now, it occurred to me that instead of speaking to you about a certain small phase of the coinage of Armenia, it might be more interesting if I were to give you a general picture, a sort of bird's eye view of the coinage of Armenia in ancient times and what has been done to study them. As you all know, the Armenians in the past have had 4 dynasties. For instance, in the old days, we've had the dynasty of Artaxias, or as we Armenians say, Ardashesyan Halestutun. This dynasty lasted from 200 BC until the time of Jesus Christ. During this period, we've had a number of kings, and practically every one of them has struck coins, some of which has reached to us. They're quite rare, and in some cases there are only one or two in existence, excepting in the case of Tigranes the Great, who has a very large number of coins struck not only in Armenia, but also in the ancient Seleucian kingdom, the mint city of Antioch and Damascus. Most of the Tigranes coins which we have today are struck either in Antioch or Damascus. They're silver coins, beautifully made, and one of the finest examples of artistic exhibition of coinage from ancient times. There are some copper coins also left to us, but unfortunately, because copper does not withstand the ravages of time as well as silver does, there are very few of them in existence. Our second dynastic period, that of Archaeology or Archaeology, which lasted from about 53 AD until 430 AD, almost 400 years, we're not certain whether there were any coins struck in this period. During this period, the royal family of Armenia was the junior member of the reigning royalty in Parthia. And many of the Armenian kings bore names identical with the Parthian kings. And since the coins bore the name of the king, it is very difficult to say whether that coin was struck in Parthia or Armenia. One of the greatest collectors of Parthian coins, the Russian nobleman of Armenian descent by the name of Alexander Petrovich, had a very, very large collection of Parthian coins of this period. It was his opinion that some of these coins were struck by the Armenian kings. And this opinion is held by some numismatics today. Others disagree and feel that because the Armenian kingdom at that time was a junior member of the family, they didn't dare strike coins. And all these Arshagid coins struck during these 400 years were actually struck in Parthia or Persia. So here's a period of 4 centuries which needs to study in order to clarify and determine whether there were any Armenian coins struck in this period. Now, both in the first and the second dynastic period, the lettering on the coins was Greek because it was this period was before the discovery of the Armenian alphabet. Our third dynastic period, that of the Bagradids or Bagradunyan Haristutun, which existed during the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, has not left any coins. It is quite likely that because the Bagradids were a small kingdom, they didn't dare antagonize either the Byzantines or the Arabs and continued to use either Arabic or Byzantine coins. However, during this period, there were 2 or 3 minor Armenian kingdoms. There was the kingdom of Van, of Vaspuragan. There was also the kingdom of Gars. And in the mountains, there was also the kingdom of Borige. There is one solitary example, king, who left a coin to us. It was struck about 1000 AD. The coin is very similar to Byzantine coins. On one side, it bears the picture of Jesus Christ and the Armenian inscription, Jesus Christos. And on the other side, the inscription in Armenian, Der Okne Gorige Gudabaradin. As you know, Gudabarad is the Armenian version of the Curopalatus, which was the title given to Byzantine governors. So here was a minor king in the Middle Ages in Major Armenia who had struck a coin which has come to us. There are 4 or 5 of these coins in copper in existence today, and there is one in silver, which I believe is at present in the Museum of Etchmiadzin. The 4th dynastic period, that of the Ruthenians, which lasted from 1080 to 1375, is the richest as far as our numismatic history goes. From this period, we have literally thousands of beautiful coins, both in gold, silver, and copper, all bearing Armenian characters and describing sometimes the name of the king, other times the city in which these coins were struck. During the Ruthenian period, from 1080 until 1196, it was not really a kingdom. The territory was ruled by princes. In 1199, Leo II, prince, was crowned king of Cilician Armenia and struck coins as king of Armenia. While he was a prince, he struck some copper coins, and there are several of them which are in existence today. Prior to Levon Arachin, there were 2 or 3 instances of princes striking coins which have reached us. These coins are quite rare, and there are only a few in existence. However, after the establishment of the royal family, there were mints established in the capital city of Sis and also in Darson, and very large numbers of coins were struck in these 2 cities. Now, what has been done to study these coins? It's very difficult to study coins that were struck 2,000 years ago or even earlier. We know that even before the first dynastic period, there were kings ruling over Armenia, and there are some coins which have reached us, but we know very little about it with certainty. Most of the studies done on our coinage has been of the Ruthenian period, because that period from 1080 until 1375 was the period of the Crusades, and there are a great many records left, not only by medieval Armenian writers, but also by historians who accompanied the Crusades and wrote their impressions of this period. Armenian coins first attracted attention in Europe in 1644, when an Italian numismatist by the name of Sestini came across a bilingual coin of Hetum I. On one side there was an inscription in Arabic giving the name of the Sultan of Konya, the Seljuk Sultan, and on the other side was an inscription in Armenian. He was unable to decipher the Armenian inscription, but described in detail the Arabic inscription on this coin. Thereafter, there were periodic publications in numismatic journals about Armenian coins. 100 years ago, a French Armenologist by the name of Victor Langlois began seriously studying Armenian coins. He was a great historian and a great numismatist. He studied the Armenian coins which then existed in several European museums. Then he went to Cilicia and collected some coins and studied them. Then he went to the Mekhtarian congregation in Venice and studied manuscripts. Then he went to Genoa and Venice and studied the archives in these 2 cities concerning the trade that the Venetians and Genoese were carrying out with Armenia in these days. And finally, he brought all his knowledge together and published a very interesting book on the coinage of medieval Armenia, and also another book on the coinage of ancient Armenia. It was a very good beginning, although by today's standard, the book is full of errors and mistakes. But it was, as I said, a beginning in the study of Armenian numismatics. At about the same time, a member of the Viennese Mekhtarian congregation, Father Sibilian, began seriously studying Armenian coins. About 1856, he began writing a treatise on the classification of Ruthenian coins. But seeing that he did not have sufficient subject matter, he left his book, went to Armenia, spent some years in Cilicia, examined the collections in private as well as public museums, and all in all, after having examined nearly 5,000 Ruthenian coins, sat down and wrote a book on the classification of Ruthenian coins. This book is a classic even to this day, although material discovered since that time has shown that certain periods pertaining to the latter part of the kingdom are inaccurate by today's standards. The Civilians book was published in 1896, although it was written some 30 years earlier. From 1896 until 1934, there was very little work done in this field. In 1934, Basmadjan wrote a book on the general numismatic history of Armenia, in which he described not only coins struck by Armenian kings in Armenia, but also by foreign rulers such as the Romans, the Tartars, the Arabs, who came to Armenia, ruled the country for a while, and struck coins in Armenian territory. It's a very good general treatise on the subject, but not quite a scientific study as was Civilian's work. In the past few years, the former Catholicos of Cilicia sent a young man to Europe by the name of Bej Garabedian to study the coins which are in existence today in the European museums. Mr. Garabedian went to Vienna and spent some 3 months in classifying their Armenian coins. Then he went to Venice, where there are a large number of coins also, classified their coins. Then he went to Paris and classified the collection of Musée de Médailles, as well as several individual collections. Unfortunately, due to financial circumstances, he was unable to publish the results of his work, and they remain unpublished to this day. In the past few years, I have also taken a serious study in the numismatics of Armenia. My pet subject is to solve some of the problems which remain to be cleared in connection with the study of numismatics in Armenia. I might give you one example in this case. During the period of the Ruthenian kings, we've had 5 kings by the name of Leo and 4 by the name of Constantine. Now, the coins of Constantine III and Constantine IV are very similar to each other, and it's almost impossible to distinguish one from the other. I collected quite a few of these. Then I weighed them, determined their specific gravity, and thereby determined the silver content of the silver coins. After I had done that with 60 or 70 coins, all of a sudden the picture cleared up. The whole thing divided in 2 parts. Some were much richer in silver than the other. And the number in existence of the one set was much greater than that of the second set. We came to the conclusion that since Constantine III had more prosperous times, therefore it was quite likely that his coins had a higher silver content. And also, Constantine III ruled for 18 years, therefore it is to be expected that there would be a greater number of Constantine III coins of that type than there would of the next king. So there was one way of, in a way, attacking it from a chemist's angle of solving a problem which had not been solved to this day. There is another very interesting problem which we're studying today. That is the possibility of existence of gold coins from this period. There are records of about 18 gold coins which are very similar to the silver coins. They bear Armenian characters, there's the picture of the king and so on. Now these coins are too few in number. It might be that they were struck as medals and given by the king to princes on certain occasions. On the other hand, we have in the archives of Venice and Genoa medieval records which speak of Armenian gold coins in the hundreds and in the thousands. Now, we don't know whether they're speaking of these as being real coins or whether they were coins of account. In other words, I could say that so-and-so paid $10 million to Mr. B. Well, there is no $1 million piece. It's just that they're denoting a certain sum. It may be that they're referring to these gold coins as a measure of so many silver coins. Now, we're very fortunate in this country that we have not only eminent numismatists in the American Numismatic Society, but we have also a number of well-known historians who are interested in this subject. In this particular phase, Professor Kruger of the University of Cincinnati is a recognized authority on the history of medieval Genoa, and he's undertaken to study these medieval Italian records to determine whether there were a large number of Armenian coins which have not yet been recognized as such to this date. Now, before I conclude my talk on Armenian coins, I think it might be of some interest to you if I were to tell you something about the existing Armenian collections. So many people, especially Armenians, have never seen an Armenian coin, an ancient Armenian coin, that I think it might be interesting for them to know that there are probably 10,000 Armenian coins in existence today. Of these, over 3,000 are to be found in the Museum of the Mukhtarist congregation in Vienna. They have by far the largest collection in the world. I am the proud possessor of almost 1,000 Armenian coins, and there are 2 or 3 people, one in Beirut, who has several hundred collections. There are collections in the hundreds in the Musée des Médailles in Paris, in the congregation of Mukhtarian congregation in Venice. The American Numismatics Society in New York has a very fine collection of several hundred Armenian coins. There are individuals in the United States and in Europe who have fairly large coins, so that all in all, there are quite a number in existence, although they have not been thoroughly studied. I feel that numismatics, or the study of coins, is part of our past history, past culture, and art. And as such, I think it deserves more study than has been done in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bedoukian. We have time for just a few questions tonight. I know it would be unfair to you and to our speakers. Those who have not participated in an Armenian group before should know that questions are an integral part of such an assembly. Tomorrow, Dr. Robert Minshall and Dr. Arshak Sarkisian will speak at 3 o'clock in Phillips Brooks' house, which is just across the street here. Are there any questions now on the last 2 speakers?